Kevin D. Williamson is National Review's roving correspondent. He is the author of The End is Near and It's Going to Be Awesome, How Going Broke Will Leave America Richer, Happier, and More Secure, The Dependency Agenda, and The Politically Incorrect Guide to Socialism. He's also contributed chapters to The New Leviathan, The State versus the Individual in the 21st Century, and Future Tense, Lessons of Culture in an Age of Upheaval. Williamson began his journalism career at the Bombay-based Indian Express newspaper group and spent 15 years in the newspaper business in Texas, Pennsylvania, and Colorado. He served as editor-in-chief of 3 newspapers and was the founding editor of Philadelphia's Bulletin. He's a regular commentator on Fox News, CNBC, MSNBC, and NPR. His work has appeared in the New York Post, the New York Daily News, Commentary, Academic Questions, and other publications. He's a native of Lubbock, Texas, and he lives in New York City. For the past 2 weeks, Kevin Williamson has been teaching a seminar on the topic of covering controversy to journalism students like myself. When I first heard that a correspondent for National Review would be teaching a class at Hillsdale this semester, I had a few assumptions. He'd be conservative, knowledgeable, entertaining, insightful. The things I did not anticipate were the shaved head, the hoop earrings, the black boots, the distressed jeans, the large goatee, and all these things made a striking impression when I walked into class. And 2 weeks later, I can tell you that he definitely earns all of these things. As you will see, the things he has to say are as arresting as his appearance, so please help me welcome Kevin D. Williamson.
He's too young to know you don't actually earn this. Every year the line where I have to stop shaving kind of comes down a little bit. They figured out who I am here at Hillsdale because there are 2 coffees here, which is nice. Thank you all for having me out here. It's been a fun week. So there's a famous Swedish heavy metal guitarist by the name of Yngwie J. Malmsteen, who I'm sure all of you know. That first name is, again, it's Yngwie, which is Y-N-G-W-I-E. He's Swedish, I believe. And every time I see that name, I think to myself, wow, Yngwie J. Malmsteen, I am glad he puts that J in there. Because otherwise we would confuse him with all of the other Yngwies who are crowding the popular consciousness, which is a very long way of getting around to saying that I'd like to thank John J. Miller for arranging for me to be here. Oh, and since we're on the subject of heavy metal guitarists and John Miller, we could just do a whole talk on the relevance of rock and roll music in the liberal arts curriculum, because I understand that's what John is now working on. And my sources at the Collegian tell me that he is responsible for a pending literary colloquium on the work of Iron Maiden. Which that's pretty retro, but all right. But again, thank you all for having me here. It's been a tremendously fun week. So some of you may know, maybe it wasn't in my introduction, I went to college at the University of Texas at Austin, and though I think I've had enough Austin for one lifetime, it's still a city for which I have a great deal of affection and fondness. It's just kind of really a very pleasant place. And Austin's unofficial municipal motto is "Keep Austin Weird." And I understand and endorse the sentiment, but in truth, there's really nothing weird about Austin. If you've ever spent any time there, Austin is, as cities go, as close to a perfect representation of American popular culture as you could imagine. It's exactly the sort of place you would expect it to be. There was an article earlier this week on a website called Medium, and it was bemoaning the sort of creeping, regnant sameness that one sees in cities all over the world when one visits them. I think this particular article was about Buenos Aires. And it's not that you're getting, McDonald's and Walmart and, sort of American franchises and TGI Fridays and that sort of thing everywhere. But it's this sort of hipster refinement, that all the bars are sort of like, all the restaurants are sort of like, everyone's having the same conversations about the same books and the same movies and that sort of thing. And every time I visit Austin, I really notice this, because every year it starts to feel more and more like Brooklyn. And albeit Brooklyn with better weather and a friendlier tax regime. But Austin is very much what the cool kids of the 21st century think of, as a city of what the good life looks like. And I would say much more so than they actually do Brooklyn, because Austin is a place that is certainly less stressful than New York City, but also a place that is intellectually and culturally dominated by a very large university. And for the tastemakers of our time, the good life looks a lot like undergraduate college life. Sort of an extended undergraduate career is kind of where they want to be. And I had a good time in college, don't get me wrong. But I don't really think of college life as being the model for adulthood. Is that an understatement? But of course, when people say they want life to be more like college, they don't actually mean this college, right? They mean UT and Berkeley and places like that. So you come to Hillsdale and you meet these kids who have worked very hard to get here and to come to this very unhip and unglamorous corner of Michigan where the weather's really nice in the winter. And they've come here to, yeah, thanks John for the winter assignment, by the way. And they come here to study Latin and have conversations about Aristotle and read about Winston Churchill and the Constitution and take history very seriously. And I didn't meet one student during the time I was here whose plan was to become an internet billionaire or to figure out a way to turn his life into some sort of extended exotic overseas vacation on some poor unsuspecting nonprofit's dime. I remember I met a girl at a seminar one time and asked her what she wanted to do in life. She got out of school and she said, I want to work for a nonprofit. And I said, well, what kind of nonprofit? Well, I don't know, I just want to work for a nonprofit. So you don't care what the organization does as long as it doesn't make money, right? Is that what it is? And that was kind of basically it. So I did meet a number of students in my class who, God help them, want to be journalists, and I didn't discourage them too much, I hope, during the course of the time I was here. But I did meet some kids who seriously want to try to change the world in a way that's not necessarily self-enriching or self-aggrandizing, and I think that's admirable. So and all this happens with no inflows of government money, which from the point of view of Austin, which is also a state capital, is very perplexing. So if there's one thing I take away from my 10 days here, it's for God's sake, keep Hillsdale weird. And that weirdness actually is in part, oddly enough, what I've come here to talk about tonight. We're at a very peculiar and strange moment in terms of our public discourse, of how we talk about politics, how we talk about public affairs. And it's an environment that is, in my view, incredibly corrosive and terrifyingly insidious. And there are some things that we can do at the margins to improve that, and I'll talk about that a little bit later in my talk. But the only real antidote in the long term is what happens on this campus and places like it, which is the careful cultivation of serious thinking. There simply is no substitute. So we've seen cities before paired and used as metonyms for particular worldviews and particular sort of ethics. You have Athens and Jerusalem in Strauss's work. In Charles Murray, you have Belmont versus Fishtown. It's a little dated, by the way. Fishtown's kind of a yuppie, well up-and-coming place now. But you get I know more about Philadelphia than I'd like to. So I think if you want to understand what's wrong with American public discourse, you could do worse than to compare the ethics of Austin and Hillsdale in terms of their intellectual climates. Austin's a very techie sort of place. It's a very internet-oriented place. Most of the businesses there that aren't government are technology-oriented in one way or the other. And of course, I like that very much. I'm sort of in that business myself. But much of the corruption of our discourse from which we're suffering is something that really originates in new mental habits associated with online communication, and particularly with social media. And before I go on, I should emphasize that this is not intended as a condemnation of the internet-based model of communication. It's a very important thing in the world. It's been something that's been very important in my life. And it's not only part of my livelihood, which I do care about in spite of having been an English major. It's also something that's enabled small magazines like National Review and others like it to reach a much wider and broader and more diverse audience than we would if we were constrained by the economic and logistical limitations of print. It's just, it's an undeniable thing, and as a lifelong newspaper guy, I kind of hate that a little bit. I do find it a little depressing. You know, I can write a cover story for National Review, and it'll go out to the newsstands and go to the subscribers, and I'll let it sit for a week or 2 weeks and kind of, you know, keep track of what sort of feedback I get, you know, how many people are talking about it, who I hear back from. And then we'll put it up on the website for 4 hours for free, and I compare it with that. And of course, it's overwhelming compared to what you get online. And then if you're lucky enough to, say, get a link from the Drudge Report, then, you know, you're talking about 100 times or 500 times the feedback. And every now and then I get 120 seconds on Fox News to talk about something, to yell at Juan or whoever. And then the feedback you get after that is proportionally even larger. So I love print, I really do. I like to think I have newspaper ink in my blood. But print is sort of a single shot 22, whereas the internet and broadcast media are more like a howitzer. I wish it were otherwise, but it just isn't. So there are things we like about online communication and social media, right? One of the things we like is that there are effectively no barriers to entry into that market. I think this is an excellent thing. If you were going to start the New York Times today, well, first of all, you would be a fool. And he mentioned I started a newspaper in Philadelphia. Not the smartest business decision ever. But if you're going to start the New York Times today, you know, you would need $1 billion. You know, and this press has cost a couple $100 million a piece. You know, all the capital you would have to put into it would be a very difficult thing to do. You would have to have a lot of resource to do it. But to start an online alternative to it or an online competitor to it costs basically nothing. All you need is time and something interesting to say and an internet connection, which God knows what the FCC is going to do with that, but right now you can still kind of get one, and they're not too expensive. So that's one of the things we like about it. You can actually get into this market fairly easily. The online model of communication is radically non-hierarchical. And sometimes people think it's weird to hear a conservative come and say, you know, we like these non-hierarchical institutions, but in fact it's really very important. If you have political views, social views, certain sorts of cultural tendencies that are or have been shut out of the mainstream media, then you will develop a real appreciation for the non-hierarchical model of communication we're talking about here. You know, William F. Buckley started National Review back in 1955 to do what the New York Times and Time and Life, if you're under 40, have someone explain to you what life is later, could do at the time, but simply would not do. It's far easier to do that sort of thing now. You don't need a bunch of generous donors. If there are any National Review donors listening, never mind that, we do need you. But you don't need the permission of the editors of the New York Times to get your message out there, or the producers of CBS Evening News, or anything like that. So which is to say the model is very democratic in a sense. And as a conservative, anytime something is described as democratic, I'm a little skeptical of it. And so, I mean, there is an upside to that, but there are some trade-offs as well. And so it's very democratic, but it's in a sense the wrong sort of democracy. It's kind of the democracy that John Adams warned us about. And that's something to keep in mind. So, I mean, we're all adults here. We all know there are trade-offs, right? I mean, there are things you're going to do in a certain way that will bring benefits and impose costs. All mature people understand that there are trade-offs. And the trade-offs that are inherent in our current internet-powered model of communication are pretty serious and things that need to be considered, I think, carefully. So the absence of barriers to entry means that there are more points of view represented, that people with interesting but unusual or eccentric ideas have a much easier time reaching an audience more quickly, more efficiently than they could have 20 years ago, to say nothing of 40 or 50 years ago. But it also means there's no one there to keep out the cranks and the charlatans and the party hacks and the hucksters of various kinds. And, you know, the flat-out liars, which is, you know, ends up being a real problem. Having a radically non-hierarchical model of social communication means that the power of self-interested gatekeepers, and I always use the kind of Olympian example of the editors of the New York Times, but all the other media as well, their power is greatly diminished, so we all cheer that. But it also means that their power to demand basic intellectual standards, good journalism practice, accuracy, ethical behavior is also greatly diminished. Those old gatekeepers did not always use the power they had wisely or intelligently, and they certainly didn't use it even-handedly. But they did perform an important role, and there's no one really out there doing that now. So is it more democratic? No doubt it is, and like all expressions of democratic power that are unhooked from moral and philosophical and political guardrails, it is something that is degenerating into something like mob rule. This, of course, would not be such a big deal if we were talking about the crazy rants that your cat lady aunt publishes on her Facebook page. Because, there's a pretty easy way to deal with that, right? Unfriend. Or, muting, blocking. I actually dumped Facebook a few months back just as a time suck and as a poor investment of my quickly diminishing intellectual resources. I'm feeling a little overtaxed. The problem is that this internet-powered model of communication has deep and complicated influence on traditional forms of media and journalism and commentary, and on intellectual institutions more generally. The immediacy of online communication has changed editorial processes in really very important ways. There's a lot less editing. There's a lot less fact-checking. There's shorter turnaround times. It used to be a big thing if you got a story at noon at a newspaper and you had to have it done by 3 for an early edition. Now if we give someone a story at noon, we want it up at 12:30. There are upsides to this. Things are quicker, more complete. There's more things to go to, but there's been a consequent lowering of intellectual quality, broadly speaking, of both American journalism and commentary. There's also the fact that traditional media outlets have to compete with content that is generated and distributed for free online. We hate that, by the way, in the newspaper business. We really do. But this has led to some really poor editorial decision making, and I'll give you an example of that. So my hometown newspaper is in Lubbock, Texas, called the Lubbock Avalanche Journal. If you've ever been to Lubbock or seen pictures of Lubbock, by the way, you will be equally mystified about why the newspaper is called the Avalanche. Because it does snow there, but there's really nothing off of which to have an avalanche. It's pretty flat. No one's really ever been explaining that to me, but there it is. I worked at that newspaper for a while. So in August of 2014, the Lubbock Avalanche Journal published a piece by a woman named Carol Morgan. Carol's a local Democratic activist. She writes regularly for the opinion section of the newspaper's website. And the article was headlined, air quote here, "Rick Perry, newest member of GOP Felons Club." So the article is prima facie libel, inasmuch as Rick Perry is not a felon. You become a felon at the point you're convicted of a felony, which he has not been, probably won't be. So if Rick were, of course, inclined to sue over this, he would have an open and shut case. Now, governors don't generally sue nobody, newspaper columnists writing for free on the website of the Lubbock Avalanche Journal, so you kind of get away with it. But so you'll recall that Governor Perry was indicted by Austin prosecutor's office for the purported crime of having vetoed a piece of legislation. She didn't want to see vetoed because it was funding for her office. And apparently this is now a crime in Texas. So it's an absurd case, but even if it weren't an absurd case, it's an open case, and certainly will be for a while. And however you feel about the case, the facts are the facts. Rick Perry isn't a felon. You don't get to call him one. You don't get to describe him as one and talk about what it means for the state of Texas to have a felon for its governor and all that sort of stuff. It's not a matter of opinion, it's a matter of fact. You can think Rick Perry is a terrible guy and a dope, and you can think he should be convicted of a felony even, but he's not a felon. The same author goes on to libel Tom DeLay, who you may recall some years ago was indicted by the same prosecutor's office Also, a kind of a silly case. If you remember the delay case, he was accused of having broken a law that hadn't been passed at the time he was accused of having broken it. Do I need to tell you that Austin is a Democratic city? Probably not. So that case was ultimately thrown out. In fact, it was sort of laughed out of court. The last judge that looked at it sort of wrote a scathing opinion on it. But this same columnist goes on to describe Tom DeLay as a felon, even though he's not. He's been completely exonerated. Still waiting for his apology. So you've got two people who are not felons, but it doesn't stop the Lubbock Avalanche Journal from falsely and maliciously describing them both that way. And this is an important part of our public discourse. People don't know necessarily going to a newspaper column that it's completely full of falsehoods. So I bugged the editor and the publisher of the newspaper about this because I do sometimes have free time on my hands. And their stance was, and I kid you not, that they cannot be held professionally responsible for the stuff their newspaper publishes on its website because, wish I had a drum roll here, they don't bother to edit it. Yeah. They don't bother to edit it. So people like Carol Morgan are generally not paid for their contributions. They're not members of the staff. And the point of view of Morris Communications, which is the company that owns the Lubbock Avalanche Journal and a number of other newspapers, is that these writers are simply just sources of online clicks. They're little bits of a revenue stream for which their publishers and editors are willing to accept absolutely no editorial or moral responsibility. The story is still up on the website, still uncorrected. I've, personally bothered the editor and the publisher both about this. I don't think Rick Perry probably has. I care more about it than he does, probably. This is not just libel. I mean, it's not just legally wrong. It's something that's morally and ethically wrong, and something that undermines people's trust in the long term in newspapers and other sources of allegedly responsible media. So under most understandings of the law, editors and publishers are legally responsible for what's on their websites. They're certainly morally responsible for it, and they are professionally and ethically bound to refrain from publishing, at the very least, things they know not to be true. And if they learn they're not true, they're professionally and ethically bound to acknowledge that and to correct these things. And they just don't do it. In the age of internet-based communication, there are very, very strong economic and practical incentives to pretend like that's just not your problem, to ignore all of the ethical and moral and professional responsibility attached to the profession of being a newspaper editor or a newspaper publisher. So, absolute falsehood, not on your crazy cat lady aunt's Facebook page, on a century and some odd years old newspaper that used to employ me. Actually, that's kind of why I care about it. It's on my resume. I don't want them to. But we're not just talking here about under-resourced, struggling daily newspapers in places like Lubbock, Texas, which, let's face it, is not the world's center of intellectual conversation and literacy, Texas Tech notwithstanding. Forbes, some years ago, made the disastrous decision to adopt something like a Huffington Post model of commentary, where basically anybody can publish a column on Forbes as though they were a Forbes columnist, as long as you're not expecting to get paid for it. So as you can imagine, this attracted the worst sort of people. Party hacks, ideologues, maniacs, fanatics, and outright charlatans like Ralph Benko. I don't know if you know Ralph Benko at all, but so I'm going to take some personal examples here just because I pay more attention to my own life than I do other people's lives. So Benko, who's a columnist for Forbes apparently, has used this platform to publish things that simply aren't true, things that are demonstrably, documentably untrue, not questions of opinion, but questions of fact. I know this because I've been on the receiving end of it. So without going too far into the economic weeds, there was a piece I'd written about per capita economic growth in the United States that he had treated as though it were net growth, not per capita. And as those of you who are economic students know that over a relatively long timeline, those numbers end up being radically different. So, a pretty gross mischaracterization of what I'd written, but, people make mistakes like that all the time. So I, wrote the guy up and said, Ralph, you got it wrong. It's actually per capita. You'll see there I wrote per capita 7 times in the column, and there's a graph that says per capita economic growth. But, you miss things sometimes. And so the guy turns around, writes a second column, completely ignores the fact that he's made the mistake, repeats the same accusations, based on the same thing, and knowing at this point that it's false, having been informed by me a couple of times that it simply wasn't true. So, yeah, I was so bugged by this that I actually went so far as to write Steve Forbes himself to inform him the sort of intellectual fraud that's going on in the magazine that bears his name. Last I checked, Ralph Benko still writes for Forbes. The piece has never been corrected. It's been years now. And Forbes is still refusing to take any editorial responsibility for the stuff published under their name. It's fairly shocking. So, I'm a conservative, as you may have guessed, and looks notwithstanding, I suppose. I think the world really needs another conservative who looks like Tucker Carlson. And Tucker's a handsome guy, don't get me wrong. But, so I'm picking these from the conservative side of the bench because, this is sort of my side. Forbes is a pretty conservative magazine, pretty conservative opinion section. Ralph Benko is associated with the American Principles Project, which really ought to be ashamed of itself for that sort of intellectual slumming. Lubbock, my hometown, is a pretty conservative place. It's 70-odd% Republican in presidential elections anyway, although not an especially conservative newspaper, but certainly a conservative community. And things are pretty bad on our side. And as you may guess, at least from my point of view, things are considerably worse on the other side. You have New York Magazine, a very highly regarded magazine, still publishing Jonathan Chait, whose intellectual dishonesty is just serial and has been documented by all sorts of people, myself included, but also writers for The Atlantic and other non-raging right-wing outlets. The New York Times is what it is. So I had a student from the Collegian interview me when I first got out here, a very nice girl, and she sort of gingerly and shyly asked me whether it was the case that I actually had argued at some point that all women who have had abortions should be hanged. Okay, spoiler alert, short version, no. So this comes from a publication called Little Green Footballs, which is a sort of lefty, weirdo online publications, another exemplar of this sort of intellectual dishonesty that proliferates not only online, but increasingly in our normal media and intellectual institutions. And I could tell you the whole story of how this was cooked up. I don't want to bore you with it. I'm generally against capital punishment. I'm generally against abortion. I'm always against ex post facto punishment, and always against lynching, I think. So, a fairly cooked up thing. But it's one thing for an undergrad at Hillsdale to ask me this question. She was probably 19 years old or 20 years old and hasn't done a lot of this sort of reporting. I got exactly the same question a couple of weeks ago from a senior Republican staffer in the Senate when the Senate Finance Committee invited me to come down and testify about tax policy, which is a weird conversation. Kevin, we'd like you to come down and talk about tax law, but first, can we have a real quick conversation about whether it's actually the case that you want to lynch women who've had abortions? And, I was a little disappointed. You hate to see that from the Republican side. You'd think they would know better. But an organization that bills itself as the world's greatest deliberative body apparently is reading something called Little Green Footballs and not thinking twice about it. So, with friends like these. So these sorts of, instances of intellectual dishonesty, myths, lies, fabrications, whatever you want to call them, proliferate and have an eternal life. And they do that for two reasons. The first reason, of course, is the reason that explains most of human history, which is that people aren't very smart. There are a lot of people who aren't very smart out there. They will believe anything that's put in front of them that's attached to something that looks authoritative. This is why newspapers still publish horoscopes, right? I actually worked for a newspaper that had an astrologer on staff. We had a full-time staff astrologer. And so I show up there and whose office is that? Well, that's the astrologer. I was like, cool. We have our own horoscope column? No, he doesn't write the horoscope column. What does our astrologer do? He advises the publisher. Most profitable newspaper I've ever worked for in my life, incidentally. So the first reason is people are dumb. It's a tragic state of human life. People are not very smart. Second reason is that there are a lot of smart people who simply want to believe bad things about people who are different from them, right? They want to believe that if someone disagrees with them on a matter of politics or a matter of religion or a matter of a social question, that these people either must be secretly motivated by some evil thing, usually the Koch brothers, or oil money. If I actually had all the money from the Koch brothers and the oil companies that people have attributed me over the years, I'd be the guy endowing this seat, not the guy here singing for his supper. I don't know if you know my colleague Charlie Cook, a young Englishman with whom I do a podcast, who's been down here to speak to you. About once a week, someone online will describe Charlie as crazy right-wing Christian fundamentalist homophobe. Maybe in different order, but something like that. Charlie is actually an atheist who supports gay marriage. We're working on it, don't get me wrong. But those are Charlie's views. But these are just sort of useful insults to throw at someone. Doesn't matter what Charlie's writing about. It could be gun control. He's a homophobe. I get the homophobe thing a lot too. And I've just moved out of New York recently, but I used to point out, I'm a theater critic who lives in Tribeca. You really think I'm trying to organize my life around my hatred of gay people? It doesn't sound very likely. But so it goes from the top to the bottom to the bottom to the top. If you go to Twitter and look me up sometime, you'll find all sorts of tweets that I allegedly have sent that are actually just fabrications made in Photoshop, sent out by someone running an anonymous account. And Twitter will sometimes delete those if you complain about it, but they pop up more quickly than you complain. Always anonymous, of course. Well, I guess except in the case of, since I'm naming names tonight, Matt Brunig, who's that idiot young socialist who, does he write for Rolling Stone or someone? Rolling Stone's not having a good year of it. But no, he doesn't write for Rolling Stone, I take that back. Anyway, he occasionally just made up quotes and attributed them to me, just to sort of discredit me. This is a guy who's actually published by respectable publications like the New Republican and other places. So that sort of thing happens, and anonymity is a big part of the problem in that particular set of situations. But you'll see flat-out libel and bad standards and intellectual dishonesty from mid-market newspapers, like the one in my hometown, to Forbes, all the way up to the work of the once esteemed Dan Rather, who ended his journalism career peddling fraud. Peddling a fraud that he was very strongly inclined to believe, which turned out not to be true. And that's an example of why this is a sword that cuts both ways, because Dan Rather's malfeasance was exposed by a lot of people online. Bloggers, dispersed sort of media critics, a couple of other journalists operating on the internet. And that's really something that social media and that sort of thing is good at. So you've got someone like Dan Rather who's a single high-profile target with a job to lose. So getting someone like that to correct something or pointing out that his work is erroneous or dishonest is fairly easy. It's one thing to get Dan Rather fired or to force Rolling Stone to correct a story that turns out to be entirely fraudulent and fictitious. But it's another thing to get millions of anonymous people who have no reputations to defend, no editors to police them, no jobs to lose, and no professional or ethical standards to live up to tell the truth about things, to engage in serious, rational political discourses, what a society like ours needs, like every other free society. And that, unfortunately, is where we are right now. These are the loudest and most influential voices in our politics. They may not be for you, especially if you're, over 50 or over 60. You're probably not getting most of your news and commentary through social media. But it's probably certainly true of your kids and your grandkids. The number of people on Twitter on a given day, I would guess, dwarfs the circulation of all the newspapers in the United States combined. Probably many times over. I should look at the numbers. So there's some things that we can do to police that. We can develop a new social media model that reinstates some of that lost sense of hierarchy and responsibility and ethical standards, and that's actually something that I'm working on myself. But there's really only so much you can do with that, because that means you have a business model that's based on excluding most of your potential readers and therefore most of your potential revenue. And unless you're, someone like me without particularly good business sense, that doesn't seem like the way to run anything. You want to maximize your readership, you want to maximize your revenue sources, which means necessarily lowering your standards. And if you wanted to double the student body of Hillsdale, you'd have to lower your standards. You just certainly would. There's no question about it. So, solutions to this. Ultimately, what's needed, of course, is a return to the idea of intellectual honesty and authority, or at least trustworthiness. And this isn't something that's necessarily going to be rooted in professional prestige. If you're familiar with PolitiFact, which is one of the worst things in American media, just absolute rank, despicable intellectual dishonesty. The guy who runs that sits on the Pulitzer Prize Committee, which is, I hear, fairly prestigious. If you're listening, no. It isn't necessarily going to be based on credentials. Paul Krugman, who is a great peddler of intellectual dishonesty, has all the credentials a man could ever want, including a Nobel Prize in economics, or as Jay Norling would say, a Nobel Prize in economics. And it's not really about judging people based on errors either. I mean, errors are an important thing to notice and to correct, but everyone makes errors. We all understand that. That doesn't necessarily disqualify someone. I made a fairly serious error about 2 weeks ago where I was calculating the value of the median income in 1940 in 2015 dollars, doing the inflation adjustment. I just hit a wrong button somewhere, or put a wrong number in somewhere, and I was off by a couple $1,000. Never trust an English major's math, first of all. But this is where things like Twitter are really helpful. I had 25 people in an hour probably point out, really, you got this wrong, you need to fix this. So you go fix it, you acknowledge your error, you go on with your day. You say, I make math mistakes all the time, big deal. So there's no shame in making an error. The shame is in refusing to acknowledge the error, refusing to correct the error, or even worse, what we're running into a lot, is presenting things that you know to be erroneous and false as though they were true. This is a fairly serious problem. In the end, this has to be based on reputation, on having a real track record for intellectual honesty. But in order for that to work, you have to have people who really care about it. You have to have people who care about reputation. And that certainly matters on the supply side. It would be better if journalists and editors and people in media were more self-respecting and had higher standards. And standards in media are hilariously low. I got a call the other day from a producer of a large television program on a cable news network that I will not name. Not Fox News, though, I'll say. And the question was, we need someone who's an expert on Russia in 2 hours. Can you come and talk about Russia in 2 hours? Do you know anything about Russia? And so I said, all I have to do to be an expert on Russia and to be on a large television show as a Russia expert is tell you that I am. Apparently so. I actually declined that one, although I've been on all sorts of shows talking about all sorts of things I know nothing about. Happens all the time. So it matters on the supply side, but it matters a lot more on the demand side. You simply have to have a readership that actually really cares about these things, a readership that demands high intellectual standards, basic honesty, factual accuracy, and ethical conduct on the part of journalists and the institutions that publish them. You have to have people whose minds are cultivated to seek the truth, both in the common sense of that word and the sort of capital T truth sense that you get maybe in your philosophy classes and things like that. And that really is the difference, I think, between life in the Austin ethic and life in the Hillsdale ethic. Unfortunately, we don't really live in Hillsdale. We live in Austin. We live in a world that's governed by fashion and shallowness, and where a strong commitment to basic intellectual standards is not something that is going to thrive in an era in which the most trusted man in cable news is Jon Stewart. He's fine, but he is a comedian. So nothing is really going to change, I'm afraid, until and people start to demand that it changes. And I think the only way to do that is through, well, as I was saying, if journalists have to be self-respecting and need to develop a stronger sense of self-respect, and certainly news consumers need to do the same as well. The habit of looking at something that just confirms your pre-existing prejudices confirms your pre-existing biases, flatters your view of the world, that allows you to derive satisfaction from a facsimile rather than from the real thing, is awfully close to pornography. And I don't really think pornography should be our model of news. With that being said, I will take some questions.
Thanks again, Kevin Williamson. We have a couple microphones here, and so please raise your hand and stand up when the microphone's brought to you. And he has told me that he can answer any question on any topic because he's an expert on everything. So go ahead and ask away, but please stand up when the microphone is brought to you. Thanks.
2 questions, actually.
Before you get started, I just want to say that I wrote that ending that way because I have mentioned pornography in every speech I've done here, including the one at the Hillsdale Academy, which the poor headmaster was sort of going, what have I done? So I don't think my next trip back will be very soon. Yes. What can I do for you?
Okay, so the Koch brothers are on the right track, and I know this would be a losing proposition, but why would they not have invested in the media in a great way instead of leaving that to like Gannett and other folks? This seems like it's almost criminal. So you lose whatever, $1 billion. All right, does that make a difference for you for the right cause? But the other question is,
let's go ahead and give that the courtesy it deserves, though, $1 billion.
well, I mean,
Even if I had 2 of them, losing 1 would still kind of hurt.
we're talking about the Koch brothers. Okay, but anyway, the second question is, do you think Brian Williams will survive his own hubris? Thank you.
Well, I hope he survives it. But no more than that. Well, I'm not privy to why Charles and David Koch make the business decisions they do. Who knows? There was a rumor some years ago, maybe a year or 2 ago, that they were going to buy the Los Angeles Times, which was up for sale, which is America's worst big city newspaper. The LA Times is hilariously bad. Mickey Cowles, and if you follow Mickey Cowles, he used to write these wonderful things about here's what the LA Times missed today. And there'll be a story about a shootout that happens in the streets of Los Angeles, 10 blocks from the LA Times. And it'll be in the Detroit News, and the Philadelphia Daily News and Inquirer, not in the LA Times. It's a really shockingly bad newspaper, other than Jonah's column, which is awesome. But so I think that the Koch brothers probably don't invest in media because they don't make investments to lose money. Which isn't to say that media is necessarily a bad investment. Newspapers actually do pretty well. For all the complaining and bellyaching you hear, most media properties are actually fairly profitable. They're just not as profitable as they used to be. Back when they were monopolies and there was no internet, and so all the classified advertising and all that stuff had to go in the newspaper. They used to make, profit margins of 20, 21%. Walmart doesn't do that. Goldman Sachs doesn't do that. Apple might. But so now they're back down to normal business profit margins of a couple of points, and they're all in a panic. That's why all these newspaper companies, all these media companies went bankrupt over the last few years, because they had their newspapers were all profitable, but they had taken on so much debt as companies that with the lower profit margins they couldn't service their debt. I used to work for the Journal-Register company, which owned a whole bunch of newspapers, all of which made money, or most of which made money anyway. And the company managed to go bankrupt publishing newspapers that were profitable. Twice. Journal-Register company shareholder. I've got the stock option anyway, paperwork sitting somewhere, which I pull out to depress myself every now and then. But Charles and David Koch are people who have been in the chemicals business and the papers business and the energy business and the timber business, none of which are very much like the newspaper business. They don't have any particular expertise in media. I think their interests, so far as I can tell, and I guess in the interest of full disclosure, I did used to work for the Institute for Humane Studies. I think Charles Koch is on the board there. They're donors, I know that. But they seem to be more interested in long-term intellectual development and also in immediate campaign issues. So if your program is to influence the way a culture operates and the way people think, And starting a newspaper is not a real good way to do that. There are better ways to do that, the think tanks and the other things that we do, academics. If you're looking to change election results, starting a newspaper is a real bad way to do that. Better just to give money to candidates or to independent groups and things like that. So I'm guessing it just doesn't fit in with their portfolio. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
Mr. Williamson, thank you. Thank you so much for your time today and coming out and speaking to us. Here at Hillsdale, we have, I guess you could say, almost three kind of factions that shape our political discourse. And so you'll have the conservatives, you'll have the libertarians, and you'll have these kind of social conservative type people. And the debate always seems to come down to how does one balance principle with prudence in the sense of how are we to approach, I mean, you see this is going to transition to 2016 too with candidates like Ted Cruz and candidates like Jeb Bush. Where do we draw that line? How do we articulate that as students here at Hillsdale, as standing for principle, but also in a way that is prudent, that can get a lot more people on the train for that mission? Thank you, sir.
Well, in terms of advising people how to structure messages in order to be successful in political campaigns, I have nothing useful to say. I've never worked on a political campaign. I don't vote. It's a long story, but I haven't voted in a long time. So I'm not sure I have much interesting to say on that particular subject. In terms of, in people's own individual lives, how do they balance various competing impulses? I'm someone who's generally described as a libertarian. Be safe to describe me as a sort of near anarchist, probably. Maybe not even near, but that's a long story too. But also someone who thinks of myself as a social conservative in the sense that I care very much about things like abortion. I mean, in everyone's life you have competing sets of values. There's no good that excludes all goods, right? I mean, you guys here getting classical educations, you know the argument that goods have to be consistent with other goods. How each person understands that and what it leads them to think in terms of policy issues is I think a matter of general education and wisdom and personal development. And also a matter of proportion. I mentioned my friend Charlie earlier, who's actually just written a book on this very subject called The Conservatarian Manifesto. You're welcome, Charles. Free plug. But I think it does matter a great deal the sort of weight you put on issues. I'm someone who thinks of myself as a social conservative. I'm pretty conservative on issues like marriage. But I really don't care very much about gay marriage. I mean, compared to something like abortion. I mean, they're both things that I think maybe you should care about. But in terms of their importance to the world, in terms of the question of what's actually being perpetrated, I mean, abortion is just a much more serious issue. I mean, if you believe that this is the unjust taking of human life, it's just more important than whether two guys can share a bank account and get a legal union and have some, Episcopalian who recognizes gay marriages these days, have someone bless their union and all that sort of stuff. I'm not really a big fan of gay marriage, but it's just not nearly as important an issue. It's not something I get out of bed for, to be honest. So yeah, I think there's a question of proportion there too. Next.
Thanks for coming tonight. With the Saul Alinsky tactics being used against you and against any conservative that lifts its head above the wheat field, do you see the new, younger group of politicians that are coming along being able to freeze it and turn the tables a little bit and start to make an impact on the Senate that should abolish the filibuster and do the same back to Harry Reid? Do you see that happening at all?
Yeah, I hope they don't abolish the filibuster.
Just for 2 years.
That seems like cheating. I like the filibuster for a couple of reasons. One, just because it's old, and I do have a Burkean element, I think, to my thinking. What Jonah Goldberg would call the Animal House version of conservatism, that it has a long tradition of existence. So we like it for that reason. I also like the filibuster because it stops government from doing things. And, I love a government shutdown. Belgium had one for 2.5 years, something like that. I really wanted to move to Belgium. It's different. I'm a writer, so I write books, I do journalism, I do talks like this. And though we like to think of ourselves as doing something intellectually serious, and maybe on a good day I do, I'm basically in the entertainment business, right? People want to read my stuff because it's kind of fun to read, and maybe it's informative as well, which is very different from being a politician and someone who's running for elected office. So for me, when people come out and say crazy and insane things, I just retweet it and publicize it. I think it's hilarious. If I'm Ted Cruz or Rand Paul or Jeb Bush or someone who's running for Congress in the 19th District of Texas, which is my home district, you can't really do that. You can't really just make merry about this sort of thing. So for politicians, I have no idea what they should do. The only advice I ever give politicians is the last line from T.S. Eliot's On the Difficulties of Statesmen, which is resign, resign, resign. Yeah, it stinks to be them. I have no idea what they should do, though. I mean, me personally, I laugh at it. I amplify it as much as I can. I've made a lot of obscure people briefly well-known, which makes me laugh and happy. It's the sort of thing that it doesn't do a lot of damage to you if you refuse to take it seriously. I'm thankful that I work at National Review, where you've got a lot of editorial support, where I don't have to go in and explain myself to Rich Lowry or Jack Fowler every day, where they know what I'm doing and what I'm up to, and they trust me. And so I get to just sort of, laugh at these kinds of things. And it's a large enough publication that people know what I actually believe if they're interested in it. And if they're not interested in it, well, I don't have anything to say to them anyway, so. Any more?
Hello again. I just wanted to say...
Haven't you got all the questions out of your system?
This is not a question, actually. I just wanted to say on behalf of the Collegian and the journalism program, thanks for being here and helping us out for a couple weeks. And we kind of wanted to give you something. And we just started making these mugs for the Collegian.
Nice. Great.
Which is more of, a kind of a moral gesture than anything else. But we did just start making them, so you should know you are the first Pulliam Fellow to get an official Collegian mug.
Awesome. Thank you.
In your,
I don't actually care. Coffee's coffee.
in your book, The End is Near, in the chapter on education, you wrote that the education field is one of the few fields, if not the only field, that confuses the product with the consumer. Could you explain that a little more?
Well, yeah, sure. That's a softball. Thank you. It's one of my favorite subjects. The current model of public education really goes back to Bismarck. And the model is essentially a factory. The idea is that the state, capital S state, requires people to do certain things. It needs bureaucrats to staff the government. It needs people to serve in the economy as educated workers and things like that. And if you take a factory model of the state, then the customer is the state, and the products are the people. You send your kids into the factory and they come out finished products. This is a very German idea, and not the best kind of German idea. This is not the Mercedes-Benz German idea, but the sort of marching angrily into France German sort of idea. And I think it's just a terrible way to think about things, especially in a modern world where factories really aren't the best metaphor for anything anymore in an economy like ours. So in a sane and sensible and humane world, the customers are the people being educated. What we're trying to do is give them something to improve their lives, whether that means through occupational training to help them to earn money and have a livelihood, whether that means through the liberal arts to help them cultivate their minds, make them better people. Now, this is also good for society. I mean, there's always that argument. It's better to have educated people than uneducated people. You have to be pretty well educated to be a citizen in the meaningful sense of that word. But you should never confuse the product with the customer. And I think this sounds like hyperbole, but it's not. We have a Soviet model of education. We have a model in which the state owns the means of production and is a monopoly everywhere it goes. And they're trying to make it more of a monopoly. I wrote the other day about a movement that's afoot to ban private schools. People want to ban homeschooling because they want to defend that monopoly. And of course, it does a really pretty bad job, as monopolies tend not to have happy customers. So yeah, I think it really matters. And it's not just a matter, I think, of rhetoric and language and metaphor, but I think it's something that's literally true, that if you don't think of the students as being your customers and their families as being your customers, then you're never going to get it right. And we still talk, I mean, you hear Barack Obama talk this way, George W. Bush before him, as though the schools were factories that were putting out widgets in human form in order to serve the economy, to serve the state, and to serve ends associated with people other than themselves. And I think that's just insane.
Kevin, can you explain more about what it means to be a Catholic anarchist, which you mentioned earlier? I believe you described yourself that way in a recent NRO article. What does that mean? Are those ever at odds?
Well, it's not the 1400s anymore. We Catholics have come a long way since then. Although some things still, very much exist the way they always have in the Catholic world. I was having dinner with some very nice Hillsdale folks who had me over. I was ambushed when they asked me to say grace. Of course, I've been in New York for a long time. We don't really say grace that much out there. But secondly, one of the reasons I converted to Catholicism is, we have professionals for that sort of thing. I don't want to think up a prayer on the spur of the moment. I got a guy in a uniform. Come say the prayer. I joke about being an anarchist, but it's not really entirely a joke. If you look at what the federal government does, and this is a big part of my book, if you look at what government does, broadly speaking, and you measure that by what it spends money on, then 80-odd% of federal spending is Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, national defense, and interest on the debt. National defense is generally around 18% of that. So that leaves us with 60 to 60-odd% of government, and maybe more if you start cutting some of the defense stuff that isn't really defense spending. That's pointless. That could be and should be replaced by private sector alternatives. I don't think there's any serious argument that Medicaid is better for anybody than market-based health care. If you look at the studies of Medicaid outcomes, people on Medicaid and people who don't have any health insurance at all. And it's not surprising why when you think about it, because Medicaid reimbursements are pretty low. If you're a really good doctor, you don't sign up for it because you can get better rates doing other things. So certainly at the federal level, I suspect that 90-odd% of what we spend money on could certainly be replaced with superior private sector alternatives. And that includes some things like some law enforcement activities, some legal questions, replacing some courts with private sector tribunals and, what's the word I'm looking for? Arbitration, yes, thank you. So that's not, getting rid of 100% of the government, but, or I'm talking about maybe 95%. Most of what your local government spend money on is your schools, public schools. If we had any sense at all, we would just categorically and immediately abolish tomorrow. We'd fire all the employees, burn the buildings down, destroy the records, and salt the earth and start over again. This would be, far superior. So to the extent that I think that most, and maybe even at some point all of what government does, and I'm into some crazy things like privatizing money, which I think would be a great idea to have market-based currencies rather than government-based currencies. And it's fringy stuff, I know, but it is something that I believe in. So, compared to where we are, describing that as something close to anarchism is I think correct. Although I talk to people like, sort of Ted Cruz fans and Rand Paul fans who describe themselves as quote-unquote constitutional conservatives. And I think that's great, and I understand the sentiment, and I endorse that sentiment. I say, you really want to reverse American public institutions back where they were in the last years of the 18th century. Okay, fine, if you really believe that, but that's far more radical than anything I've proposed. So, yeah, I think it's all pretty sensible. In terms of does that run up against my Catholicism? Not too much. The history of the Catholic Church is that when it gets in bed with government, things go wrong. There's a nasty business in Spain there for a couple of hundred years. But I think, and here's something I've thought a great deal about and that I believe to be true, that if you get a retreat of the political organization of life, of the coercive, government-run models of how we educate our kids, how we take care of the poor, how we pave the roads, how we do anything else, how family life is defined and organized, then you've got a lot more room for other models to grow. And if those of us who are Christians, those of us who are social conservatives of other religious backgrounds or no religious background at all, if we're right that our way of doing things actually is better, then this should show up in the market, right? If you develop truly uncoercive, free associative models for doing these things, then conservative versions of what family life should look like, what marriage should look like, all the rest of it. You all know I smashed someone's cell phone once upon a time, right? You've seen the story. If we really believe that our way of doing things is better, let's put it to the test. Let's let people decide for themselves, organize their own lives, and see what happens. And I think in that kind of an atmosphere, particularly the Catholic Church has a lot to offer. The Catholic Church actually has a history with running big school systems. It used to be that the vast majority of kids in New York City were educated in Catholic schools. It has experience with running healthcare systems and things like that. And so I would think that in a more libertarian environment, the churches and religious organizations and those sorts of groups would and could and should step up to discover better ways of doing things. One more? All right, last one.
I met you briefly with my husband, who is a fan of yours, but I have a question, or rather a comment and a question about something you mentioned earlier when somebody gave you an offer to express an expert opinion, and I admire the fact that you quickly dismissed that offer.
Well, in all fairness, there was no money involved.
Well,
and $20, I'm a Russia expert.
My question is why would you not consider looking into that area a little bit further? And I would like to explain why I am worried about the state of United States media and how they cover Russian news. In particular, I'm a dual citizen, and I read both Russian and American press. And I'm outraged by the amount of Russian propaganda that is seeping into mainstream media. Now, I'm not surprised by that, knowing that Vladimir Putin spends oil money that can quite easily compete with some of the most wealthiest news networks in the United States. And Russia Today is one of the largest channels that is aired in over 100 countries, reaching over 700 million people. I can actually watch it at home. I never thought moving to the United States that I would be able to watch Russian news on a little channel, not owning we don't watch cable. But there's a lot of young journalists that are being recruited. A few of them quit just recently because even in their little consciousness, they were bothered by some of the things that they had to recently air on air. But what I was going to ask you is why you wouldn't look into that, because there is a huge need, as it appears to me and many other free-minding, there's not very many of us, there's a huge Russian population living in the United States that listen to Russia Today, and unfortunately a lot of Americans that reprint without checking the sources and reprint it and spread it in the United States, and why you would...
Sure, let me go ahead and address
why
that
you
for
wouldn't look into that. It seems like there is a lot more need. America is waking up to the recurrence of red terror. And
All right, I'm going to go ahead and treat this as a question now.
Yes.
And send the essay later. Why don't I know more about Russia? Because I don't care about Russia very much. I probably should. I just don't. There are only so many things in the world you can care about. My foreign interests are mainly India. I started working there, South Asia. I covered a number of that things, some of Latin America. I agree with you about RTV, which is a pretty naked propaganda network. One of my favorite things I ever saw happen on that, you all know Jamie Kirchick. He's a liberal writer, sensible liberal though. Jamie was invited to go on Russia today and talk about, I don't remember what it was some U.S.-Russia relation thing. But Jamie is gay. And as you know, in Russia under Putin, there's a great deal of persecution of gay folks. And so they get on and they ask him whatever question, and he takes off his jacket, and he's wearing this sort of rainbow suspenders. And he just totally ambushes them and starts lecturing them on the persecution of homosexuals in Russia and how awful it is and why RTV is a sort of awful Kremlin propaganda network. And I thought that was just terrific. It made me very, very happy to see. I mean, that is an example of, free societies are fragile in some ways. I mean, they're unfragile in some ways, too, because you have lots of different ways of doing things. So if one thing breaks, you've got other backups. But if you're going to have a free society, then you're going to have people who exploit that. If you're going to have a free society, you're going to have foreign governments using their funds to run propaganda networks in your country, which is exactly what the Russians do with RTV. If you have a free society, you're always going to be vulnerable to things like terrorism, just because there's no way to defend all the shopping malls and movie theaters and buses and subway cars in a free society. On balance, I think it's worth it to be a free society, even if that means putting up with some Vladimir Putin propaganda from time to time. And it is comically bad, I think most people understand. Although maybe not, I mean, again, as I said, some people aren't very bright. And their sort of, anti-American slant appeals to a lot of people. Oddly enough, there are a lot of people who don't like their own country all that much. And, but in the end, I think it's worth it to be open rather than closed, even if that means enduring some things you don't like enduring. Thank you all so much. I appreciate it.